It is 11:47 p.m. on June 1, 2026, and the first radar signatures appear on Ukrainian air defense screens stretched across the eastern horizon. Not one contact, not two, but a cascade of them, blooming on the display like a deadly constellation slowly moving west. And the operators watching those screens have seen this pattern before. They know what it means. They have lived it dozens of times across 4 brutal years of war. But tonight, something feels different. Tonight, the numbers climbing on those radar screens are not in the dozens. They're not even in the hundreds of the usual kind. Tonight, Russia has decided to send a message that cannot be misread. Tonight, Vladimir Putin has authorized the largest single aerial assault in weeks, a combined wave of 73 cruise missiles and 656 Shahed kamikaze drones, 729 weapons of destruction, all pointed at the sleeping cities of Ukraine. And the men and women at those radar consoles have seconds to begin the cascade of warnings that will travel down through the chain of command, city to city, region to region, sounding the sirens that will drive millions of civilians into basements, subway tunnels, and reinforced shelters before the first explosions light up the sky. Kyiv is the primary target tonight, as it so often is, the symbolic crown of Ukraine that Russia has never stopped trying to break psychologically even when it cannot break it militarily, and the capital's air defenses come alive with practiced precision. Anti-aircraft batteries track incoming targets, interceptor missiles launch in tight succession, the sky above the city filled with the streaking light of defensive fire. And by the time the dust settles, Ukrainian air forces report that 40 missiles and 602 drones have been destroyed or suppressed, an extraordinary defensive performance that, nevertheless, cannot stop everything, because the mathematics of saturation attacks are ruthless. Because when you send 729 weapons at a city, some will always slip through, and tonight they do. The first confirmed strike hits a residential building in the Shevchenkivsky district of Kyiv at 12:31 a.m., a building where families were sleeping, where children had gone to bed hours before the sirens sounded, where an elderly couple on the 4th floor heard the warning but did not make it to the staircase in time. And the explosion that follows is not the dramatic Hollywood fireball of action movies, but something far more brutal and mechanical, a concussive force that tears through concrete and steel, that collapses ceilings onto the people below, that turns ordinary domestic space into rubble in 0.3 seconds. And the screaming that follows is not background noise, it is the sound of a city being punished for the crime of existing as a free nation. By 2 a.m., reports are flooding into Ukrainian emergency services from 7 distinct districts of the capital simultaneously. Fires burning in apartment complexes, a warehouse complex in the Darnitsia district engulfed in flames, a logistics hub at the city's eastern edge hit by 2 separate drones in what analysts will later describe as a coordinated targeting sequence, and the emergency response infrastructure of Kyiv, honed by years of this exact scenario, deploys with grim efficiency. Firefighters racing toward multiple sites, paramedics triaging casualties in the streets, police cordoning off collapse zones where the structural engineers are not yet certain the remaining walls will hold. Dnipro receives the next wave, a city that has endured more strikes per capita than almost any other in Ukraine, a city whose residents have developed a fatalism about sirens that coexists somehow with a fierce refusal to leave. And tonight, Dnipro's mayor, Boris Filatov, is already awake when the first explosion sounds near the industrial district, already calling emergency coordinators, already preparing the statement that will come hours later when he declares a day of mourning, a statement he will issue just 20 minutes before yet another drone strikes a residential building in the afternoon, as if the war refuses to even pause for grief. Kharkiv, the northeastern city that sits just kilometers from the Russian border, takes hits to 4 communities in the surrounding region, 14 people injured, including 1 child, buildings damaged across a swath of territory that has been under near constant bombardment for 4 straight years, a city that has somehow maintained a civilian population, that has somehow kept its university partially open, that has somehow kept its cultural life flickering, despite being closer to Russian artillery positions than many frontline towns in other countries would consider survivable. Zaporizhzhia takes 6 ballistic missiles overnight, targeted strikes at what Russian military planners designate as dual-use infrastructure, which is their operational euphemism for the water treatment plants, the energy substations, and the industrial facilities that keep a city of 700,000 people alive through winter and summer alike. And the impact of those 6 missiles is not just the immediate craters and the structural damage, it is the downstream disruption to civilian life, the pressure drops in water systems, the rolling power outages, the hospitals switching to generator power, all of that invisible cascading suffering that never makes the dramatic headlines but constitutes the true sustained assault on Ukrainian civilian resilience that Russia has been waging since the beginning. By the time morning breaks on Ukraine on June 2nd, the confirmed death toll stands at 22 civilians with 138 people wounded, and those numbers will continue to climb through the day as rescue teams reach the deeper collapse sites and as some of the critically injured do not survive their injuries. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addresses his nation and the world in a morning statement that carries no surprise but enormous weight, describing the attack as, quote, an explicit statement by Russia that if Ukraine is not protected from ballistic missiles and other missile strikes, those strikes will continue. A statement directed not just at his own people, but at the capitals of Europe and at Washington, where the debate over Ukraine's air defense shortfalls has become increasingly urgent. Because the uncomfortable truth embedded in this attack is that Ukraine's air defense capacity has been strained by the parallel demands of the American military's ongoing engagement against Iran, draining Western stockpiles of the interceptor missiles that are the only reliable defense against ballistic threats, leaving Ukrainian cities more exposed to the Orishnik hypersonic ballistic missiles that Russia has begun deploying with increasing frequency and confidence. On the front lines, the ground war grinds forward with its own terrible momentum, and June 1st's battle reports tell a story of relentless Russian pressure that has not diminished despite the enormous casualty figures, because Russia has demonstrated throughout this conflict a willingness to absorb losses at a scale that would have ended any Western military campaign years ago. And on June 1st alone, 249 separate combat engagements are recorded between Ukrainian defense forces and Russian assault units across the entire length of the front. 249 individual firefights, ambushes, armored pushes, and drone duels happening simultaneously across hundreds of kilometers of contested territory, a tempo of combat violence that has no real historical parallel in modern warfare outside of the Second World War's Eastern Front, which is not a comparison anyone makes lightly, but which the raw numbers increasingly demand. The Pokrovsk sector, the most contested stretch of the Donetsk front, sees 36 separate Russian assault attempts in a single day, 36 times that Russian infantry and armor move forward into Ukrainian defensive positions, absorbing fire, leaving dead, occasionally piercing the line, occasionally being repulsed entirely, the aggregate of those 36 attempts representing a grinding attrition strategy whose logic is not brilliance but mass, the understanding that Ukrainian defenders cannot be everywhere at once, that somewhere in those 36 attempts one will find a weak point, one will find a position undermanned by exhausted troops at the end of a rotation, one will find the gap through which a small advance can be exploited into a larger one. The total confirmed Russian military losses since February 24, 2022 have reached approximately 1,366,910 personnel as of June 2nd, with 1,440 Russian troops killed in just the preceding 24 hours alone, a number that sits in the official Ukrainian tallies alongside daily confirmation of tanks destroyed, artillery pieces wrecked, armored vehicles burned, and aircraft downed, numbers so large that they have lost the power to shock in most Western media coverage, but which represent a genuine strategic hemorrhaging of Russian military capacity, a slow-motion catastrophe that analysts note has reached a point where Russia is consuming trained military personnel faster than its training pipelines can replace them with genuinely capable soldiers, rather than the hastily prepared conscripts who have been thrown into frontline combat with weeks of preparation duration rather than the months that even basic military competence requires. But the war does not only move westward tonight, because Ukraine has learned across 4 years of conflict that the most effective way to impose costs on Russia is not to match its mass on the front line, but to strike deep, to reach the infrastructure that sustains the Russian war machine, the oil refineries that provide fuel for the tanks and aircraft, the ammunition factories that feed the artillery, the transportation nodes through which supplies move from deep Russia to the front. And on the night of June 2nd into June 3rd, Ukrainian long-range drone operators plan and execute one of the most symbolically resonant deep strike operations of the entire conflict. St. Petersburg, Russia's second city, the crown jewel of Russian cultural heritage, the city Putin calls home and where he has built much of his political identity, hosts on June 3rd the opening of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the annual gathering that Russia styles as its answer to Davos, its showcase of economic resilience and global partnership in defiance of Western sanctions. An event attended by business delegations from across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, a forum designed specifically to project the image of a Russia that is not isolated, not weakened, not losing. And it is at precisely 5:47 a.m. local time on June 3rd, as the first forum attendees are preparing for the day's opening sessions, that the first Ukrainian drone finds its target at the St. Petersburg Oil Terminal, the largest oil handling complex in northwestern Russia, a strategically designated facility spanning 37 hectares with 21 storage tanks and an annual handling capacity of 12.5 million metric tons. And the explosion that follows is not a small fire quickly contained. It is a primary detonation that triggers secondary explosions as the heat reaches adjacent tank infrastructure. And within minutes, the black columns of smoke visible from the city center are exactly the kind of image that no amount of press messaging can counteract, because there is no press release that explains away the sight of your flagship strategic energy terminal burning on the morning you are trying to tell the world that your country is strong. Governor Alexander Drozdenko of the Leningrad region reports that 30 drones were shot down over the region, an acknowledgement that the attack involved far more than the single weapon that ultimately reached its target, confirmation that Ukraine sent a coordinated swarm designed to overwhelm point defenses, to ensure that at least some fraction of the attacking drones pierced the layered Russian air defense umbrella, and the fact that at least one did, that at least one drone found the terminal and set it ablaze on the most politically sensitive morning Putin could have chosen for a major attack on critical Russian energy infrastructure, speaks to the precision and the intent with which Ukraine is now conducting its deep strike campaign. Simultaneously, during the same overnight window, Ukrainian drones attack the JOC Progress plant in Michurinsk in Russia's Tambov region, a facility that produces not cooking equipment or agricultural machinery, but high-technology aviation control systems and missile guidance components for Russia's military. The kind of facility whose disruption does not produce dramatic footage of burning tanks, but whose damage works its way through the Russian defense industrial complex over weeks and months, slowing production, delaying deliveries, forcing substitutions that degrade the quality of the weapons Russia sends to the front. And this is precisely the logic of Ukraine's deep strike strategy, to not merely destroy visible assets, but to corrode the invisible systems through which Russia sustains its ability to make war. Back in Moscow, the Kremlin's communications apparatus faces a contradiction it has been managing since the first days of this conflict, but which grows more acute with each passing week. The contradiction between the triumphalist narrative of a special military operation proceeding according to plan and the reality visible to any Russian citizen paying attention, a reality of fuel shortages at gas stations in multiple regions, a reality of rising casualty notifications arriving in small Russian towns whose sons and husbands and fathers will not be coming home, a reality of a war that was supposed to end in days but has now consumed 4 years and well over 1 million Russian casualties, and the decision to launch 729 weapons at Ukrainian cities in a single night, while militarily coherent as an attempt to break Ukrainian morale and demonstrate Russian capability, also carries an implicit acknowledgement of desperation, because you do not send 729 weapons at civilian targets if the ground campaign is proceeding according to plan. You send them when the ground campaign has stalled. when May 2026 has become the first month since 2023 in which Russia has lost more territory than it gained, when the drone operators of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces are ranging freely across Russian airspace and finding targets at will, when the strategic initiative ever so slowly is shifting. For Zelensky's government, the June 2nd mass attack and the June 3rd response in St. Petersburg represent two faces of the same strategic argument being made to Western capitals. Ukraine can absorb punishment and keep fighting, and Ukraine can reach deep into Russia and impose costs. But Ukraine cannot do either indefinitely without sustained Western support, particularly the air defense systems and interceptor missiles that would prevent the daily civilian casualties accumulating in Ukrainian cities. And it is this argument, made not in conference rooms but in the blood of 22 dead civilians in Kyiv and Dnipro, that Zelensky and his foreign minister are amplifying across every available diplomatic channel in the hours after the attack, calling it a direct consequence of depleted Western air defense stocks, naming the specific shortfalls, naming the specific weapons that, if provided, would have saved the specific lives that were lost overnight, turning tragedy into the most concrete possible lobbying document for continued military assistance. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian unmanned systems forces are not finished with June 3rd, because as the St. Petersburg terminal burns and as the Tambov defense plant absorbs damage, other Ukrainian drone teams are active in operations against Russian supply infrastructure in occupied Ukrainian territory, with confirmed strikes against a Russian cargo vessel, the Leonid Pestrikov, in the port of occupied Berdyansk on the Sea of Azov, a strike that represents Ukraine's continuing effort to deny Russia the use of occupied Ukrainian seaports for military logistics, to force Russia to route supply chains over longer, more vulnerable land routes where Ukrainian long-range fires can interdict them more efficiently. And this strike on the Leonid Pestrikov is not an isolated tactical action, but part of a coherent operational design that has been degrading Russian maritime logistics in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov for over a year, sinking or damaging enough Russian naval and civilian vessels to force a fundamental recalculation of Russia's ability to use the sea as a supply corridor. By June 3rd afternoon, Kyiv's head of presidential office, Kirilo Budanov, is briefing that intelligence assessments show a potential threat of Russian military action from Belarusian territory, a warning that echoes the opening days of the full-scale invasion when Russian columns drove south from Belarus towards Kyiv, a warning that the Ukrainian military cannot dismiss even as it is stretched across the eastern and southern fronts, because Lukashenko's Belarus has consistently served as a staging ground and a pressure multiplier for Russian operations. And the question of whether the warnings represent genuine offensive preparation or sophisticated information warfare designed to force Ukraine to thin its northeastern defenses is exactly the kind of operationally ambiguous situation that Ukrainian military planners face daily, the fog of war amplified by a sophisticated Russian information operation that has been running continuously for 4 years. What June 2nd and 3rd of 2026 represent, stripped of all the operational detail, is a war that has entered a phase of intensifying mutual escalation. Russia escalating its mass aerial campaign against Ukrainian civilians while simultaneously watching its own deep strategic rear come under increasing Ukrainian drone pressure, a feedback loop that has no obvious exit point because neither side has achieved the conditions it needs to negotiate from strength. Russia still unable to break Ukrainian resistance on the ground, Ukraine still unable to expel Russian forces from occupied territory, both sides absorbing costs that would have forced capitulation years ago in any conflict with more limited national will. And the 729 weapons fired at Ukrainian cities on the night of June 1st and the drones burning over St. Petersburg on the morning of June 3rd are not anomalies. They are the new baseline of this war's tempo.
a baseline that will continue to rise unless and until either military circumstances on the ground shift decisively enough to compel negotiation, or Western diplomatic engagement produces a framework neither side has yet been willing to accept. And for the 22 families in Kyiv and Dnipro who are burying their dead today, for the 138 people receiving treatment in Ukrainian hospitals, for the 1,440 Russian soldiers whose families have not yet been notified, the abstraction of strategic analysis offers nothing. Because in war, there is no abstraction. There is only the specific building, the specific missile, the specific second at which a life that existed becomes a death that will be mourned. And this is what 729 weapons fired in one night actually means when you strip away every other frame and hold it to the light of its most basic human consequence.